William stood alone in the cemetery, the weight of his grief pressing heavily on his chest. It had been a year since his wife, Emily, had passed away, but the pain felt as fresh as the day he had buried her. The grave was neatly kept, with fresh flowers resting against the cold stone. He knelt down, his fingers tracing her name etched into the marble. "I miss you," he whispered, his voice breaking. The silence around him was deafening, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then he heard it, a faint, muffled cry. At first he thought it was his imagination, a trick of his mind in this place of sorrow. But the cry came again, louder this time. It was the sound of a child, desperate and pleading. William's heart raced as he stood up, scanning the area. The cemetery was empty, save for him. The cry seemed to be coming from somewhere near Emily's grave. Confused and alarmed, he followed the sound, his footsteps quickening. The crying grew louder, more urgent. It was coming from the ground. His stomach churned as he realized the unthinkable. The sound was emanating from beneath the earth, near his wife's resting place. His eyes darted around, and he noticed a small shovel leaning against a nearby tree, likely left behind by a groundskeeper. Without thinking, he grabbed it and began to dig, the blade slicing through the soil with each frantic motion. The cry grew clearer, more desperate, driving him to dig faster. Finally, the shovel hit something solid. It wasn't a coffin. It was a small makeshift box buried just a few feet below the surface. His breath caught in his throat as he dropped the shovel and pried the box open. Inside, wrapped in a thin blanket, was a baby, a tiny, fragile child, its face red from crying. William froze, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. Who would bury a baby? And why here, near Emily's grave? The baby's cries softened as it sensed his presence, its tiny hands reaching out. William's heart shattered and swelled all at once. He carefully lifted the child, holding it close to his chest. The warmth of the baby against his skin felt like a spark of life in the cold, desolate cemetery. Questions flooded his mind, but for now, all he could think about was the child in his arms. He had no idea what to do next, but one thing was certain: this baby needed him. William cradled the baby in his arms, his mind racing. The child's cries had subsided, replaced by soft whimpers as it nestled against his chest. He looked around the cemetery, half expecting someone to appear and explain this horrifying situation, but the graveyard remained eerily silent, as if holding its breath. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves and the baby's shallow breathing. He knew he couldn't stay here. The baby needed warmth, food, and care, things he couldn't provide in the middle of a cemetery. With trembling hands, he wrapped the thin blanket more securely around the child and carefully stood up. His legs felt weak, whether from the shock or the physical exertion of digging, he couldn't tell. But he forced himself to move, clutching the baby tightly. As he walked toward his car, his thoughts spiraled. Who could have done this? Why bury a baby near Emily's grave? Was it a cruel coincidence, or something more? He glanced down at the child, its tiny face peaceful now, and felt a surge of protectiveness. It didn't matter who this baby was or where it had come from. It was innocent, and it needed him. When he reached his car, he hesitated. He had no car seat, no supplies, nothing to care for a baby. But he couldn't waste time. He gently placed the child on the passenger seat, using his coat to cushion it, and drove straight to the nearest store. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Every few seconds, he glanced at the baby, afraid it might stop breathing or cry again. But the child remained quiet, its eyes fluttering open and closed as if fighting sleep. At the store, he parked and rushed inside, his heart pounding. He grabbed a basket and began throwing in essentials: formula, diapers, bottles, a blanket, and a small stuffed toy. The cashier gave him a curious look as he paid, but he didn't care. He didn't have time for explanations. Back in the car, he prepared a bottle of formula with shaking hands, following the instructions on the packaging. When he offered it to the baby, the child latched on eagerly, drinking hungrily. William watched, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him: sadness, fear, and something else he couldn't quite name. It was the first time in a year he had felt anything other than emptiness. As the baby drank, William's thoughts turned to Emily. She had always wanted children, but they had never been able to conceive. The doctors had said it was his fault, a diagnosis that had haunted him for years. He had carried that guilt like a shadow even after Emily's death. And now here he was, holding a child who needed him. It felt like a cruel joke, a twist of fate he couldn't understand. But as he looked at the baby, a tiny hand gripping his finger, he felt something shift inside him. This child, abandoned and left to die, had somehow found its way to him. Maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe it was a second chance. Not just for the baby, but for him too. William drove home in a daze, the baby now asleep in the makeshift nest he had created on the passenger seat. The streets were quiet, the world outside his car feeling distant and unreal. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one question kept surfacing. What now? He couldn't just leave the baby at a hospital or call the authorities. Not yet. Something inside him resisted the idea of letting go. When he pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his house brought a strange mix of comfort and pain. It had been a year since Emily's death, and the house still felt empty, frozen in time. He carried the baby inside, careful not to wake it, and laid it down on the couch. The child looked so small and fragile against the cushions, its chest rising and falling with each breath. William stood there for a moment, staring at the baby. He had no idea how to care for a child. He had no crib, no baby clothes, no experience. But as he watched the baby sleep, a determination began to grow within him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a connection to this child, a sense of responsibility that went beyond logic. He quickly set to work, turning the guest room into a makeshift nursery. He cleared out old boxes, dusted off a small dresser, and laid out the supplies he had bought. It wasn't perfect, but it would do for now. As he worked, his mind wandered back to Emily. She would have known what to do. She had always been the nurturing one, the one who dreamed of being a mother. He felt a pang of guilt, wondering what she would think of him now, taking in a child he had no right to care for. But then he remembered her words, spoken so many years ago, when they had first learned they couldn't have children. "Family isn't just about blood, William," she had said. "It's about love. It's about being there for someone when they need you most." Her voice echoed in his mind, clear and strong, as if she were standing right beside him. By the time the baby woke up, crying softly, William felt a little more prepared. He warmed a bottle of formula and gently fed the child, his movements awkward but careful. As the baby drank, he studied its face, the tiny nose, the delicate lips, the dark lashes framing its eyes. It was a beautiful child, innocent and pure, and it deserved so much more than the cruel fate it had been given. That night, as he sat in the rocking chair he had dragged into the nursery, the baby asleep in his arms, William made a decision. He wouldn't let this child suffer. He wouldn't let it be abandoned again. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to give it a life filled with love and safety. It wasn't just about the baby. It was about him, too. This child had given him a purpose, a reason to keep going when he had felt so lost. As he rocked the baby, humming a lullaby he barely remembered, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The pain of losing Emily was still there, but it was no longer all-consuming. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Days turned into weeks, and William's life began to revolve around the baby. He named her Lily, after the flowers Emily had loved so much. It felt right, a way to honor his wife while giving the child a name that symbolized hope and new beginnings. Caring for Lily wasn't easy. William was exhausted, his days filled with feedings, diaper changes, and sleepless nights. But amidst the chaos, he found moments of joy he hadn't felt in years. The first time Lily smiled at him, his heart melted. It was a small, gummy smile, but it felt like the sun breaking through a storm. He found himself smiling back, his face aching from the unfamiliar expression. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he had truly smiled. But with the joy came challenges. William had no idea what he was doing, and every day brought new struggles. He burned bottles of formula, forgot to burp Lily after feedings, and accidentally put her diaper on backward more times than he could count. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed, when he wondered if he was doing more harm than good. But every time he looked at Lily, her tiny hands reaching for him, he knew he couldn't give up. He began to research everything he could about caring for a baby. He read books, watched videos, and even joined an online parenting forum. Slowly, he started to get the hang of it. He learned how to soothe Lily when she cried, how to bathe her without her screaming, and how to tell the difference between her hungry cry and her tired cry. It wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that was enough. As the days passed, William noticed something else. He was starting to heal. The grief that had weighed him down for so long was still there, but it no longer consumed him. Caring for Lily gave him a purpose, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. He found himself laughing more, smiling more, and even talking to Emily's photo on the mantelpiece, telling her about Lily's latest milestones. One evening, as he sat in the rocking chair with Lily asleep in his arms, he realized something profound. He loved her. It wasn't the kind of love that came from blood or obligation. It was the kind of love that grew from shared moments, from sleepless nights and early mornings, from laughter and tears. It was the kind of love that transcended everything else. But with that love came fear. What if someone came looking for Lily? What if he wasn't enough for her? What if he failed her, just as he had failed Emily? The doubts crept in, threatening to overshadow the joy he had found. But then Lily stirred in his arms, her tiny fingers curling around his thumb, and the fear faded. He would do whatever it took to protect her, to give her the life she deserved. That night, as he tucked Lily into her crib and kissed her forehead, he made a silent promise. To her, to Emily, and to himself. He would be the father Lily needed, no matter what it took. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it. One afternoon, as William was playing with Lily on the living room floor, the doorbell rang. His heart skipped a beat. He rarely had visitors, and the sound felt like an intrusion into the fragile peace he had built. He picked up Lily, holding her close as he walked to the door. When he opened it, he was met with two police officers standing on his porch. "Mr. William Carter?" one of them asked, his tone formal but not unkind. William's throat went dry. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" The officers exchanged a glance before the second one spoke. "We're following up on a report of an abandoned child. We received a tip that you might have information about a baby found near the cemetery a few weeks ago." William's grip on Lily tightened instinctively. His mind raced. How had they found out? He had been so careful, keeping Lily's presence a secret from everyone except the cashier at the store. But he knew he couldn't lie, not to the police. I did find a baby," he admitted, his voice trembling. "She was buried near my wife's grave. I couldn't just leave her there." The officers nodded, their expressions softening slightly. "We understand, Mr. Carter, but we need to follow protocol. The child needs to be examined by a doctor, and we'll need to investigate how she ended up there. Do you have any information about her parents, or who might have left her?" William shook his head. "No, I don't. I've been caring for her since I found her. She had nothing with her, no note, no identification, nothing." The officers exchanged another look. "We'll need to take her into custody for now," the first officer said gently. "She'll be placed in foster care while we investigate. You've done a good thing, Mr. Carter, but we have to make sure she's safe and that her legal guardians are found." William's heart sank. He had known this day might come, but he hadn't prepared himself for how much it would hurt. Lily was his now, not by blood but by love. The thought of losing her was unbearable. Can I at least come with her?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I don't want her to be alone with strangers." The officers hesitated, then nodded. "You can come to the station with us. We'll need to ask you some questions, and you can stay with her until she's placed in foster care." William nodded numbly. He packed a bag with Lily's essentials, his hands shaking as he folded her tiny clothes and stuffed her favorite toy into the bag. Lily cooed in his arms, oblivious to the turmoil around her. He kissed her forehead, tears welling in his eyes. At the police station, William answered their questions as best he could, but his mind was elsewhere. He watched as a social worker took Lily from his arms, the baby's cries piercing his heart. He wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but he knew he had no legal right to her. He was just the man who had found her, not her father. As he left the station that night, The emptiness he had felt after Emily's death returned with a vengeance. The house felt cold and lifeless without Lily's laughter, her cries, her presence. He sat in the rocking chair, staring at the empty crib, and let the tears fall. But amidst the pain, a spark of determination ignited. He couldn't let this be the end. He would fight for Lily, no matter what it took. She was his daughter, not by blood, but by love, and love was stronger than anything else. The days after Lily was taken felt like an eternity. William couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything but her. He called the social worker daily, begging for updates, but the answers were always the same. The investigation was ongoing, and Lily was safe in foster care. It wasn't enough. He needed to see her, to hold her, to know she was okay. Determined to do something, William sought legal advice. He met with a family lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Margaret who listened to his story with a mix of sympathy and practicality. "This isn't going to be easy," she warned him. "The courts prioritize biological family in cases like this. If Lily's parents or relatives come forward, they'll have a stronger claim than you. But if no one does, and if you can prove you're capable of providing a stable home, you might have a chance." William nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes. She's my daughter." Margaret helped him file a petition for custody, but the process was slow and frustrating. There were forms to fill out, background checks to undergo, and home inspections to prepare for. William threw himself into the task, determined to prove he was worthy of being Lily's father. He baby-proofed the house, bought a proper crib, and even took parenting classes. He wanted to show the court that he was serious, that he could give Lily the life she deserved. But the waiting was agony. Every night, he sat in the nursery, staring at the empty crib and wondering if Lily was crying, if she was scared, if she missed him. He clung to the memory of her smile, her tiny hand gripping his finger, and used it to fuel his determination. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he got the news he had been waiting for. The social worker called to tell him that no biological relatives had come forward and the court had approved a supervised visit. William's heart leapt with hope. It wasn't custody, but it was a start. The day of the visit, William was a bundle of nerves. He arrived at the foster home early, clutching a bag of Lily's favorite toys and snacks. When the door opened and he saw her, her face lighting up with recognition, her arms reaching for him, he felt like he could breathe again. "Lily," he whispered, scooping her up and holding her close. She babbled happily, her tiny hands patting his face as if to reassure him she was still his. The foster mother smiled, watching them with a knowing look. "She's missed you," she said gently. "She's been fussy since she got here. But the moment she saw you, she calmed down. It's clear she loves you." William's eyes filled with tears. "I love her too, more than anything." The visit was short, but it gave William the strength to keep fighting. He left with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to prove to the court that he was the best person to raise Lily. He started documenting everything: photos of their visits, notes about her development, letters from friends and neighbors who supported him. He wanted to leave no doubt in the judge's mind that he was Lily's father in every way that mattered. As the weeks passed, the visits became more frequent, and the bond between William and Lily grew stronger. She was his light, his reason for living, and he would do whatever it took to bring her home. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and William felt a mix of hope and fear as he walked into the courtroom. He wore his best suit, his hands clutching a folder filled with documents, photos, and letters. Lily was with him, dressed in a tiny pink dress he had bought for the occasion. She clung to his hand, her wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The hearing began, and William listened as the social worker and his lawyer presented their cases. The judge, a stern but fair woman, listened carefully, her eyes occasionally softening as she looked at Lily. When it was William's turn to speak, he stood up, his heart pounding. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "I know I'm not Lily's biological father, but from the moment I found her, I knew she was my daughter. She's brought light back into my life after years of darkness. I've done everything I can to prove that I can provide her with a loving, stable home. She's my family, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she's happy and safe." He handed the judge the folder, his hands trembling slightly. These are letters from people who know me, who've seen me with Lily. They'll tell you how much she means to me and how much I mean to her. I'm not perfect, but I love her with all my heart, and I'll never stop fighting for her." The judge took the folder and spent several minutes reviewing its contents. The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable. William held Lily close, whispering soothing words to her as she played with the buttons on his suit jacket. Finally, the judge looked up. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone thoughtful, "this is an unusual case, but it's clear that you've formed a strong bond with this child and that you've taken significant steps to provide her with a stable and loving environment. The court's priority is always the best interests of the child, and in this case, it seems that those interests align with your petition." She paused and William held his breath. "I'm granting you temporary custody of Lily. We'll review the case in 6 months, but if all goes well, I see no reason why you shouldn't be able to adopt her permanently." William's knees nearly gave out from under him. He hugged Lily tightly, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Your Honor," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you." As they left the courtroom, William felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Lily was his now, not just in his heart, but in the eyes of the law. He had fought for her, and he had won. But he knew this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear, but he was ready to face them. For Lily, he would do anything. That night, as he tucked Lily into her crib in the nursery he had prepared for her, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Emily's photo smiled down at him from the wall, and he knew she would be proud. He had found a way to honor her memory, to turn his pain into something beautiful. As he kissed Lily's forehead and whispered, "Good night, my little Lily," he felt a surge of love so strong it took his breath away. This was his family now, a family built not by blood, but by love, sacrifice, and second chances. And it was enough.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.